These are ultra clean, ultra high tech facilities, and facilities that only survive based on constant innovation. So it is not that you are just stamping the same press for 20 years over and over and drawing a paycheck. No, now you get rewarded as a young person if you go into a manufacturing site and are willing to learn, to learn how to make a product better, to make a process more efficient. So there is more room for advancement today in manufacturing than I think people think of as traditionally done in manufacturing.
Welcome to another episode of the Made in America podcast with Ari Santiago. I'm Ari Santiago, President, CEO of IT Direct. Honored and privileged today to have one of our great U.S. senators, Senator Chris Murphy, on the podcast today. I've been privileged to be on Senator Murphy's Manufacturing Advisory Council, followed his career and his exploits in Washington from afar, and very excited to have him on and talk about his view of manufacturing and its importance to Connecticut and the U.S. economy overall. Chris, thank you so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for being a part of our council. Really important to have, manufacturers in Connecticut giving input directly to me and to our office. Appreciate being with you today as well.
Listen, so Chris, it's the Made in America podcast, so we're going to start off with the same two questions. What do you make, and why do you make it?
Well, I make laws. That is my responsibility in Washington. I'm grateful to be able to represent a state that I grew up in, a state that my parents grew up in. And I'm proud of our manufacturing history. I have worked on manufacturing policy and Made in America policy for almost my entire time in Washington because my state's cultural and economic identity is tied up in what we have made, what we make, and what we're going to make. And so my job and what I make is legislation. And my goal is to lead a conversation in Washington about improving our manufacturing laws, improving our trade laws, improving our worker training laws so that we can continue to make things in Connecticut. I'm just a believer that you cannot have an economy that is only a service-based economy. You're only going to thrive if you are actually engaged in some form of manufacturing, and we have a bigger percentage of our economy engaged in manufacturing in Connecticut than the national average. Some people don't know that, and so what I make are hopefully laws that support Connecticut manufacturers.
So aside from just being in a state and representing a state that has a long manufacturing tradition and a current big portion of manufacturing, I know you're a lawyer, I believe, by training. Your father was a very successful lawyer by training, but your family history's got some manufacturing in it. Is that where your passion for manufacturing comes from?
Yeah, it is. My mother's side of the family is all from New Britain, and my grandfather and great-grandfather both worked at Fafner Bearing. And anybody who knows New Britain knows Fafner Bearing. Stanley and Fafner were the two sort of big iconic companies. And, in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, when the whistle blew, there would be 10,000 people streaming out of those two factories alone onto the streets of that city. And my mom grew up in public housing in New Britain, but the reason that she had a shot to become the first woman in her family to go to college was because of Connecticut's great manufacturing jobs. And the tragedy is that, people still look at that old Fafner and Stanley complex in New Britain. Parts of them have been torn down and replaced by new facilities, but parts of them are still there. And they think that's what manufacturing is. They think it's these big, sort of rotting, hulking buildings that are now all emptied out. The reality is we are still doing high-level manufacturing with good paying jobs with benefits. It just occurs today in industrial parks. Not many manufacturers are located in downtowns. And so, people don't see it in the way that you did when my grandfather and great-grandfather were working in those factories, but it's just as important, which is why, your efforts to really, talk about this and have a public forum to talk about manufacturing is more important now than ever. So that's, a big part of the reason why I care about manufacturing is that I think I get to be a United States senator, one generation removed from a family that was living in public housing in New Britain because of this state's history of good manufacturing jobs propelling families into the middle class.
And for those that don't know, I mean, you've been doing the Manufacturing Monday. Just this past Monday was your 200th Manufacturing Monday highlight. Can you talk a little bit about why you do Manufacturing Monday, why it's so important, and what else your team is doing to highlight the importance of manufacturing in Connecticut?
So it's a really simple thing we do. Every Monday, we highlight a new manufacturer in Connecticut, normally pretty small shops. We gather information about their history, what they make, and we send out a press release. It always gets a little bit of press, sometimes just locally, sometimes statewide. But the point is, to tell the story of Connecticut manufacturing, again, because I'm not sure that people know it like they used to know it when they had these big, more visible manufacturing companies in Connecticut. But also, we want to tell the story of these jobs. We will talk about, I'm sure, over the course of our time, the workforce crisis that we have in Connecticut. It's not that we anticipate we're not going to have enough work to fill shops in Connecticut. Our worry is we're not going to have enough workers to be able to do those jobs. And so by telling the story of these manufacturing companies, I hope that I'm sort of sending a signal to guidance counselors, to high school students, to parents, that they should really think about a career in manufacturing for their child or for themselves.
I think that's a really good point. Let's transition right to that, actually, because one of the things we talk a lot about on the podcast to try and bring awareness to manufacturing, part of that includes parents, because parents can really influence where their kids, what their kids do, and whether they support or not support that. And I think there is two kind of challenges in manufacturing. One is that it's the dirty, dingy manufacturing of the past that was dangerous, as opposed to the high-tech, lean, green, clean manufacturing of today. And so what do you tell parents if you hear about parents of your constituents who are concerned about their kids being interested in a career in manufacturing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is to tell them that it doesn't look like the manufacturing you see in the movies or from the 1950s, or the manufacturing that you remember your grandfather working in, right? These are ultra clean, ultra high tech facilities, and facilities that only survive based on constant innovation. So it is not that you are just stamping the same press for 20 years over and over and drawing a paycheck. No, now you get rewarded as a young person if you go into a manufacturing site and are willing to learn, to learn how to make a product better, to make a process more efficient. So there is more room for advancement today in manufacturing than I think people think of as traditionally done in manufacturing. So I tell them that. I tell them that, for the price you're going to put into the education, right? You need to get a degree or certificate, right? But the payoff here for amount of money you have to put into the education, for the amount of money you're going to make and the benefits and the pension, rivals or is better than a lot of payoffs you're going to get for white collar jobs that require 4 or 6 year degrees. And so just the math of this for a lot of folks makes more sense than going into debt for a $50,000 a year 4-year school. So those are the beginning things that I try to tell people about why they should really consider this profession.
What is it that so now we're looking at, kind of following on the workforce trend, just sort of 4 or 5 months ago, the real challenge was all these, jobs from all the growth. And now through COVID, there's some clouds on the horizon there. I think we're all very confident that it will come back, but there's really presents two challenges. The first side is that the silver tsunami, the retiring workforce, that's still happening, but the demand isn't where it used to be. And so what can the federal government do? What can you do in your role to help support training programs? Because we need to continue to invest to upskill the workforce that we have and continue to bring new entrants in. But the private sector is going to be strained right now because of pressures on, automobile manufacturing, pressures on commercial aerospace. These pressures are real and they impact Connecticut. What can you do in your role with the federal government to help kind of keep us on the path to continue to invest in the workforce and the residents of Connecticut for their career future?
Yeah, and I think that's right. I mean, listen, these are real concerns. Much of the economic output that has been lost during these lockdowns will come back, but some of it may not. I mean, we were in the middle of a aerospace purchasing tsunami, and there is a real question as to whether as many people are going to be traveling by plane any longer. And so you will see for the time being a pretty medium to long-term dry spell in in the pace of aerospace purchasing, which means we're going to have to get a little bit more nimble in Connecticut. But it's also part of the reason why the federal government did step up and provide help to the airline industry. Now, I may not have done the help in the exact way the bill ended up. I supported the bill, but I thought it was important to make sure that the federal government keeps these airlines afloat, just because the industry is important to commerce in the United States, but also because we make a lot of those parts inside the U.S. The other thing we can make sure is that when we're purchasing things for the Department of Defense, and we, on a per capita basis, Connecticut is 4th or 5th in the nation in terms of defense spending, in terms of where the money goes. We should be making sure that those supply chains are all American. Right now, we have more and more of the things that go into a military jet engine or a helicopter or a submarine being produced overseas. The actual final product is assembled in the United States, but the supply chains are increasingly, in Europe or in Asia. We can bring those supply chains back home, and that might be able to counteract some of the private sector decline we will see in demand.
I mean, do you think that that's going to be more of an administrative action, or do you see kind of bringing back your kind of historical initiatives? I mean, I know you introduced bills even as recently as 5 years ago to enhance the Buy American approach from the federal government. Do you think that there's any hope of a Buy American bill kind of going again through Congress? Is that even something that's on the radar? Is it administrative? What do you see in that regard?
Well, so much of it can be done administratively. Right now, if you don't want to if you're assembling a tank and you're buying parts, you do have a requirement to buy all those parts from the United States, but you can apply for waivers. And you have to show that you can't find the part in the United States, or you can't find a part that's sort of within 40% of what you could buy it overseas. Well, the administration, the president, the Department of Defense can be much stricter in how they give out those waivers. Sometimes they don't even check to see if the part actually can be made in the United States. So part of it is administrative, but then part of it is also legislative. I do have legislation that would cut down on the number of waivers. And so I think there's equal parts legislative responsibility and administrative responsibility. This is one of the few areas that I'm able to work with the Trump administration on. They actually, in the White House, do believe in strengthening Buy American laws. The problem is it is just such a dysfunctional White House that they can't seem to sort of actually take the things that they believe in the White House and turn them into action at the Department of Defense. So as much as Trump talks about Buy America, the numbers don't actually suggest that we're buying a lot more parts from American companies.
So kind of keeping on the trade thing for a second, it's been out of the news a bit, obviously, between, the protests and the coronavirus, all which deserve a lot of coverage. We seem to have sort of lost focus on the trade war and the tariffs that kind of built up. And I just wonder from where you're sitting in your perch, you have a different view. I mean, are we at kind of a level playing field now where business can rely on where we are is where we are? Do you see a lot more trade uncertainty, or potentially kind of getting back to a more partnership approach, especially with our friends in Europe, from a trade perspective, and reducing the trade risk that so many manufacturers in Connecticut worry about?
Well, that risk is great because there seems to be no predictability. One every week brings a new announcement of tariffs against China, Europe, Canada, or the threat of a tariff. And the tariff itself has an impact, but the threat of the tariff also has an impact too. So what I'd like to see is much more predictability and much more bilateral and multilateral cooperation. I have no problem with being tough on China. You just can't win a trade war with China if it's the United States alone against the Chinese. You have to be able to join together with Europe and have a common plan of attack to try to get China to reduce some of their subsidies for industry, their barriers to entry for U.S. companies, their theft of intellectual property. And so to me, that's the future here, is having a common strategy between the United States and Europe when we're going after countries like China and their unfair trade practices.
So speaking of trade, I know you voted for the U.S. Canada-Mexico trade agreement. Just quickly, your thoughts on what the impact of the new agreement will be on manufacturing in Connecticut?
Well, had the new agreement not gone into effect, the old agreement still would have been operative. And so the new agreement is an improvement on on NAFTA. Now, I have been a longtime opponent of NAFTA. The belief was that this was going to, bring all sorts of new job opportunities to the United States, and that just did not happen in the way that was promised. But the update, frankly, requires Mexico, in particular, to make improvements to its environmental standards and labor standards and put some real teeth in enforcement such that we can get closer to a level playing field. It's not going to get us to a level playing field, but we'll get closer to a level playing field with this new trade framework, and that's the reason why I supported it.
Do you think that support, and is there any other things that you're doing to encourage, you touched on it earlier in terms of Buy American, but to encourage kind of the reshoring efforts? I mean, we've seen and had people on the podcast, I believe you even highlighted some in your Manufacturing Mondays, Connecticut manufacturers who are taking lines that were moved to Asia in the late 90s and early 2000s and are moving them back and have moved them back to Connecticut. Is there anything that you see the federal government is doing or could do to help encourage that?
Well, there's this broader conversation happening in the American public today about the impact of technology and robotization, right? And you can certainly look at that as a threat to jobs as more processes are being automated. The reality is that has been, in many ways, a boon to American manufacturing because as you reduce the amount of the product's price attributed to labor, then we are able to better compete with low-cost labor countries like China or Mexico. It still requires people to run the machines. It just still requires people to buy to make the machines. And so I think we need to have policies in this country which incentivize rather than discourage automation of manufacturing, because as much as the global trend may be that those machines will replace labor, in the United States, they will actually they'll actually end up in more manufacturers being able to produce in the United States because labor becomes not as big a portion of the price of the good.
Yeah, which is really going to help the U.S. economy overall and hopefully the Connecticut economy in particular. So, one of the things that we've seen historically or that people talk about is that a great partnership between federal, state, nonprofits, a business and education, when those kind of entities are all working in the same direction, we tend to see the most results. And I think, people can point back to public-private partnerships, whether it's, DARPA or all kinds of different things that have helped kind of propel the U.S. forward in technology. What do you see the federal government can do right now to help promote that in Connecticut? Or what can you do to help bring some of that technology and that investment of federal dollars to Connecticut? And maybe it's through organizations like CCAT or CONSTEP, but what are you doing and what can you do to kind of help move that ball forward?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. And I think we just sort of have to step back and try to figure out what our baselines are in terms of federal government investment. At the beginning of last century, we made a decision as a country that we were going to provide enough free education so that every worker in the United States could compete globally. Now, back then, that was a high school degree. Today, a high school degree is not sufficient in order for any worker in this country to be able to compete globally and make a living wage. That doesn't mean that everybody needs a 4-year degree. It does mean that everybody probably needs to have something beyond high school, a manufacturing certificate, for instance. And my belief is that the government should just update its guarantee. We should decide what the level of education you need is now to compete globally, and we should provide it for free. So I do think that that's a commitment that the federal government has to make. I think we've got to make an additional commitment to research and development. You mentioned DARPA. It was federal investment that led to the invention of the internet, that led to the invention of the fuel cell, right? That and all sorts of things we now take for granted wouldn't have happened at least as quickly if not for federal investment. So we've got to put more money into places like NIST and NIH and the Institute of Sciences. And then lastly, we just have to allow manufacturers to be able to get their products to market. And as our roads and our rail lines atrophy, it just becomes a lot harder for companies here to be global players. So I just think we have to update the amount of investment we're making in people, in research and in infrastructure.
So I know we're starting to run out of time a little bit, but let me just kind of couple last questions. One is, you talk about that social compact that we have and making those additional investments. And I think a lot of people are down with investing in infrastructure, investing in people. I think education makes a ton of sense, right? We don't do anything like we did in 1900, thinking that a 1900 education system is going to work in 2020, 2021. Probably just on the face of it doesn't make sense. Where does that money come from?
So, total up all the money we spend at the federal level on those three buckets, education, infrastructure, and science, it's about 4% of the federal budget. So it's minuscule. So even if you wanted to double that, you'd be talking about less than 10% of the federal budget being dedicated to the accounts that matter most to economic growth. So first of all, you have to understand it's not that hard to find the money. Let's just take, Bernie Sanders' free college proposal, right? Which sounds to most people like a wild, radical idea. Okay, that's about $35 to $50 billion a year. That's a lot of money. We just spent that in a heartbeat in responding to the COVID crisis. The tax cut that was passed in 2017 was $2 trillion. And so I think we do have to recognize that it's not that we aren't willing to spend that kind of money. It's just that we're only willing to spend it on tax cuts that largely help the wealthy and emergency expenditures. So the money we can find the money. It's just a matter of spending it thoughtfully. Now, what we spend a lot of money on in the federal government is insurance programs, right? Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. They're about half the federal budget right now. Back in 1960, 1970, they were a quarter or a third of the federal budget. And so, the real conversation here, if you don't just want to add to the money we spend, and listen, I frankly think I can make a case to just add that additional money to the budget. But if you don't want to do that, then you can certainly find ways to sort of draw waste and fraud and abuse and just additional spending that doesn't add value out of programs like Medicare and Medicaid and allocate that money into accounts like education, infrastructure, and science.
Is there any chance of finding some common ground in the near term to make those investments? I mean, there's no doubt that we've seen and it's talked about a lot about the aging infrastructure in the U.S. Is there a deal to be had? Will we see rising investment in infrastructure and or in science and technology?
I mean, listen, if I was advising President Biden, I certainly would tell him that he should go straight after infrastructure when he is sworn in. Frankly, had Trump decided to make his first initiative an infrastructure initiative instead of trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act, he would have had Democratic support coming out the ears for that. And we would be right now rebuilding America. We wouldn't have 13% unemployment because even getting hit in the nose by COVID, we would have been spending so much money on infrastructure that it wouldn't have been as impactful. So I have always believed that there's a pretty easy bipartisan coalition around infrastructure. And my hope is that I don't think President Trump will ever be able to deliver that. But if Biden wins, I hope that would be high on his list.
So last thing before we get to rapid fire, I just want to ask you, just in light of what's been going on, with the protests and so forth, I think there's no question that Connecticut's got some polarization, certainly along class lines, and some of that divides along racial lines. But what's the federal government, listen, my view is having that polarization and some people that are undereducated and not getting the opportunities puts us at a disadvantage, not only morally, but economically, because we have a portion of our workforce that could be helping, especially in manufacturing, that isn't available to do that. What do you see as your role, your ability to help lead the way to kind of close some of those gaps in Connecticut, not just for the moral benefit, but for also the economic benefit?
Yeah, I think we've got to be willing to have some really tough conversations in this country and in this state. I'm going to be supportive of a policing reform bill, but that can't be the end of our work. We have one of the most economically and racially segregated states in the nation, and that is not okay. Our children's existence is not made richer by the fact that they are very unlikely to have a friend who is of a different race than them. And as you mentioned, when we concentrate poverty so greatly in only a handful of places, it effectively dooms those kids to failure, because when you pile on top of one neighborhood all of the traumas of poverty, the violence, the lack of access to childcare, the inability to get early childhood education, the low funding for schools, you just are not able to sort of push kids out of poverty and into jobs like the ones that you have. So it hurts our state, it hurts our moral health to be living and going to school so separately. And the keys to unlock that are really state and local decisions. I mean, the federal government is not great at coming in and telling states how to, do housing policy and education policy, but we can certainly do things to incentivize states like Connecticut to have tough conversations about why we live apart from each other, more so than many other places.
Listen, I also think engaging with the private sector community the way you do through the Manufacturing Council, through your Manufacturing Mondays, and through other ways, and just having the conversation to open people's eyes to what's out there, Chris, I think you can make an impact and a really positive one. So let me switch to rapid fire round of questions and we'll get this thing wrapped. Here we go. Red Sox or Yankees?
Diehard Red Sox fan.
That's what we're talking about. Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts?
I'm not a coffee drinker, and so Dunkin' Donuts has more food options. So I guess I'm Dunkin' Donuts.
So excluding COVID, when you take some time off, you a staycation guy or exotic destination?
Staycation. So we generally spend our vacations in Connecticut. We go down to the Connecticut Shore, Old Lyme. My family's had a place down there for a long time, and we just sort of sit on the beach for as long as we can.
Good planning there. iPhone or Android?
iPhone.
Sports car or SUV?
SUV.
If you could do anything and had to, other than be a senator from the state of Connecticut, what would you be? What would you do?
I'm a huge sports fan. Right now, I would be the commissioner of Major League Baseball, because if we don't get a baseball season started soon, many of us are going to go crazy. I mean, I love the fact that sports is coming back. I think that's really important for all of us. But as a baseball fan, I need a baseball season. And so I will volunteer to be the new baseball commissioner.
If you get some bipartisan support on some legislation that would force baseball to come
force
back.
Baseball, yeah, I know. They're all making plenty of money. It is not a matter of paupers being treated unfairly here.
Fair enough. Do you have a favorite business book?
I don't know that I have a favorite one. The last one that I read was Good to Great, which was a really interesting, fun read.
Yeah, that's a good book. Chris, what's one thing that you learned early in your life that helped propel you to all the success that you've had?
I think one thing that I learned early in life is that there's no substitute for hard work. I actually wrote that on my first flyer for the state legislature. That was like one side of the flyer was there's no substitute for hard work. I was trying to telegraph to people that if they elected me, no one was going to work harder. But I also learned that especially early in life, when you're just trying to prove to people that you want it more than the other guy, working harder than the other guy is the way to prove that. That's something I learned early on in life.
And something we all can control, how hard we work. What's one thing that you learned later in your career that you wish you might go back and tell 20-year-old Chris that if he listened to would really send him moving a little bit faster?
Well, I think what I learned later in my career is not necessarily what I would have told 20-year-old Chris, because it actually applies to sort of people who are later in life. What I learned as I got older was that, well, working hard is a very good strategy for success when you're young. As you get older and you're in a position of leadership, wisdom is what matters. And you don't acquire wisdom necessarily by just working harder. You actually have to step back from your problems and from your team sometimes and give yourself some time to think. And so what I've learned later in life is that, I still am working 18-hour days and 7 days a week. I am giving myself more pockets of time to try to step back and think.
Yeah, and get that perspective. Chris, listen, it's been awesome having you on. I super appreciate your time. I just want to end with one last thought, which is, we talked about the public-private sector partnerships. We talked about working together to make things happen. So from your perspective and talking to the manufacturing leaders in Connecticut, what can we do? What's our role to work with you? And just what can we do in general to help make the economic future of Connecticut bigger and brighter?
Well, I think it's, I think it's just this kind of engagement. I mean, sometimes I worry that the business community is so focused on taxes and regulation that they fail to often see the importance of government investment. And I understand why businesses are out there advocating for lower rates of taxes and less regulation. But if a declining tax rate means that government can't educate your workers and can't fix the roads and can't invest in science next to you, then I think you have to ask yourself, what's the purpose of the lower tax rate? Is that giving me enough benefit compared to what smart government investment would? So I just sort of ask businesses to be holistic, right? To be, sort of seeing and trying to see that big picture and helping me see that big picture as well.
Well, you can count on us to engage. Chris, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your views. I really appreciate it. I know the audience does too.
Thanks.
Made in America with Ari Santiago is brought to you by IT Direct.
As always, thanks so much for tuning in. I definitely want your feedback and hope you subscribe. But what I want the most is to build a community where we learn and grow with each other. I hope you're getting a lot of value out of the time we're spending together. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you next time.